That wasn't in my script. Uh, my name is Arran Huckstep. My pronouns are he, him. And whatever your walk in life, whatever brought you to us today, however you approach spirit, service, and the sacred, and however you move through this life, we are delighted and honored that you chose to spend this time with us. We are All Souls. Reverend Ron is up in Denver today, participating in a pulpit swap with our guest minister. The Reverend Eric Banner has joined us from First Universalist Church of Denver. And as always, a big shout out and a thank you to our tech team who are making our online portion of the service possible today. And they've also created a QR code. Okay, which is coming up shortly, which if you use your phone's camera app, you can scan the QR code, hit the little link, and it'll take you to our e-newsletter. And now, along the same lines of incorporating technology, can we take a quick moment and wave at the camera and all the folks that are at home on Zoom, joining us, friends and family members from there? Wonderful. Okay, hello everybody and welcome. For once, when I got this morning's service leader prompt, I knew exactly what I was going to talk about. I was really lucky. Really recently, I was really fortunate, to experience awe, joy, and exuberance in an encounter with nature. I'm a scuba diver, and at the end of a scuba dive, for those of you who aren't scuba folks, when you finish a dive, you get bored for a while and hang out with the other scuba divers. It's a safety thing. Nothing happens. You sit there, about 10 feet of water, doing nothing. Well, this time was different. One of the other divers started freaking out. He had a noisemaker. It's basically a rattle, just shaking it furiously and pointing, and I think I heard him going, and looked down there, and best I can describe it, it was like a crescent-shaped barbell dark thing. I was like, well, that's interesting. What is that? Well, it was coming towards us, and turns out it was a mouth. Yeah, it was a whale shark. I did a quick check. So if you're not a scuba person, when you dive, you have this buoyancy, which basically keeps you from sinking. And I looked, I had a ton of air left over because I was lucky enough to have an extra big tank that day. So I was like, I'm doing this. And I dumped all my air. And so as the shark was coming up, I was floating down, and we met. When I dumped my air, I knew I was kind of brushing up against the rules because you're not supposed to mess with these wonderful creatures, but I was passive. I was just sinking. It was coming to me. So I was perfectly within the law, I'm sure. But what ended up happening is the whole time that this whale shark interacted with us, because there was nothing, we were in open water. We'd left the reef behind, far deeper and away. We were out more towards the boats. There was nothing there except for us. It came up because it was curious. I'm not sure why, but it was an interaction that was intentional on its part. And so it was, and the other thing that was interesting for me and that added to really the spiritual aspect of this, it was how effortless it was for the whale shark, and it was for me. It came up, it never showed any signs of effort at all. It came up, never swinging its tail, nothing else, peaked, and then went back down, and it just happened to peak with me. And so this 25, 30 foot long, school bus sized being came up to say hello. And when I think of the word awe, part of it for me is I was small. I mean, the 10 of us altogether were smaller than this. And I don't use the word creature, it was a being that came up to have a look. And so as I floated down, I was close enough to touch it. I did stay legal, I didn't touch it, but it literally from head to tail came up, and I was just like this. Its tail, I put my hands around its tail, didn't touch. But the feeling of this mighty being with no effort whatsoever came up to say hello and then went right back down. And I lost my mind. I started chasing, I had air, so why not? I'm flailing, just going as fast as I can. It again, with no effort, just pulls away and disappears back down into the deep. And I think, and everybody else is kind of freaking out the same way, but I was just the lucky one who was so close and dwarfed and visited and truly awestruck in that time. And so after it disappeared and I went back with the group, I knew that I'd been touched and felt it in a way that was just the outside nature reaching in and touching me. And it was a blessing, a feeling of just gratitude and awe that a little bit of residue will just always stay with me. So, okay, our partner organization for our offering this morning is PFLAG. And I've got a little thing to read here. PFLAG is a nationwide organization of family and friends supporting, educating, and advocating for LGBTQIA2+ people and those who love them. The organization began in 1972 in New York and spread across the nation, advocating for equal rights, healthcare, and protection of LGBTQIA2+ kids and their families. Our local chapter is with us at noon today to provide an educational opportunity for our congregation. Our LGBTQIA2+ community is under attack from all over the country. I don't think we need any reminding on that. So please help support them today with your generous donation. Yeah, the instructions will be on the screen for giving online or via text. And with that, we will pass that.
A firemist and a planet, a crystal and a cell, a starfish and a saurian, and caves where ancients dwelled. In sense of law and beauty, a face turned from the sod. Some call it evolution, and others call it God.
I bet you don't know that hymn, but it is in our hymnal. It comes from an old poem by Carruthers, and it is good to be here with you and to hear those words again this morning. As Arran said, I'm Eric Banner. It is my privilege and honor to serve as the senior minister at First Universalist Church of Denver, where we have been sharing a liberal and liberating message since 1891, just as you have been doing here. And it is good to renew those connections that were so pulled and tattered these last few years of separation and quiet, and to be here and to bring the greetings of the people of Denver to you, and to thank you for sending your minister, Reverend Ron, to be with our people this morning. So the other thing that you might want to know about me for the rest of this morning to make sense is that before I was a minister, I was an environmental scientist. I worked in water quality, and I too have moments of awe and wonder. One just a few days ago, I walked out my back door. I live a block from Colfax, if that means anything to you. And there was a murder of crows, that is the technical term. There was a murder of crows on the power lines and the alley behind my house. My daughter and I were rushing off to get to swim practice, but we stopped to look at it. And I looked over, and right there, on the top of the telephone pole behind our garage, was a bald eagle with a squirrel that just hadn't quite made it through the day. I have rarely been so close to such a majestic creature. And that is part of what we're talking about this morning, the world and our place in it. There are really two ways to think about the world and all that lives within it. We can think about it as something to be dominated, to control, to rule over it. Or we can think of it as something more akin to a family, to relatives, to our relations. And each of those two views has deep religious roots and spiritual significance and meaning. And so I think it is worth asking any church you go into, and as a professional religious person, I go into a lot of them. I think it's worth asking any church that you walk into, which of those two perspectives do you teach here? Does this church teach that the world was made for people, with the intent that people should rule over all living things, seeking first and foremost our own private benefit? Or does it teach something else? Does it teach that people came from that same long lineage as all other life, every other part of this interdependent web of existence? And unless you are new here this morning, and given that there's a guest preacher and it was spring forward, I hope there's at least a few visitors. But for the rest of you, I think you already know what kind of church this is, what kind of church Unitarian Universalism is. But just to make sure it's all very clear, let me tell you something that you might not know. Charles Darwin was one of our own. Last month marked his 215th birthday, February 12th in 1809. He was born to Robert and Susanna Darwin. They were members of their local Unitarian church there in Shrewsbury, England, up in the northwest side of the country. He was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, a physician who had written speculatively about the possibility of evolution from a common ancestor in his book Zoonomia in 1794. Now, we don't have a lot of saints in our tradition, although James Reeb certainly qualifies. But if we were to collect a group of them, I think the man who wrote On the Origin of Species would be worthy of inclusion. But why do we talk about Darwin? Why talk about evolution in church? Why talk about it in a place like this? Wouldn't it be a better topic, some might ask, for the biology classroom, the science lab? What difference does it make, and why, some might ask, do those who are not evolutionary biologists care at all? Now, on a spiritual level, I think the truth that matters the most about the story of evolution is that we are part of the family of living things. That rather than the earth being something given to us to rule over, it was instead a gift to us that we're here at all. And our lives and everything about them is part of that interdependence that's present in the air that we breathe, made by the leaves of the trees and the algae in the ocean and all the other green creatures of the earth. It's present in the food that we eat, the wild places that spark our spirits, from whale sharks beneath the ocean to the eagles nesting not far away. and it is filled with whole worlds that we can only begin to imagine. It is this fundamental truth of a life well lived that we remember that we did not make the world. We didn't. And that when we begin to realize that it was made not for us, but we for it, it begins to ask us new questions. Questions about how we will live that one wild and precious life we have. And what makes this tradition unique is that we recognize that though there are fundamental truths that underlie all existence, shared in time and space, for which we have different names, we still have space for all those views. Perhaps in this room today there are liberal theists. I bet there's more than a few atheists and agnostics. There might be some pagans, some Jewish UUs. There might be a fair number of spiritual but not religious who wonder how you found yourself in a building that said church on the outside. And so in all those theological bents, what matters to us is that we come together in community and connection, which we ourselves have to work to create, to support, and sustain, even if we don't always use the same words to describe it all.
Haze on the far horizon, the infinite tender sky, the ripe rich tints of cornfields and wild geese sailing high, or hover high and lowland, the charm of goldenrod. Some people call it autumn, and others call it God.
That infinite and tender sky, it's hard to put our heads around that, I suppose. Not just our lives, that our species, but that every one we've ever loved, everything we've ever loved, every animal that's ever been a part of our life, a pet or a companion, but also the lions and tigers and bears, every lichen and every plankton, and all the creatures in between are all part of that family of life on this planet. And we are just this tiny, tiny piece of this universe that goes on and on and on, far bigger than we can ever imagine. That infinite and tender sky, not just in autumn, not just the yellow fields of corn waiting for a combine or the wild geese, but the very fabric of everything we know, bound up together in one story that's still unfolding. A story of a universe becoming conscious of itself. Years ago, the writer Joanna Macy offered a meditation on our place in that story about the passage of time, about this place that we live and hold all of our beings. I wanted to share a portion of it with you this morning. She calls it an opportunity to re-story us and ourselves as Gaia, a name she uses for the living earth of which we are a part. She invites us to come back into this story we all share, a story whose rhythm beats in us all, the story that belongs to each and all of us, like the beat of a drum, the heartbeat of a living universe, and to let that beat take us farther still. To let us go back beyond our conception, back to the first splitting and spinning of stars. As scientists measure it now, it was some 14 billion years ago that we manifested as a universe, this primal flaring forth. And there we were, careening out at the speed of light, creating space and time. We were swirling clouds of gas, and the particles, as they circled in the dance, desired each other, and they formed atoms. 10 billion years later, one of those swirling masses split off from its blazing sun, the sun we now feel on our faces, and the lifetime of Gaia began. Let us imagine, she said, that our life as a planet could be condensed into just 24 hours. A single day that begins as every day does at midnight. It wasn't until 5 o'clock the next afternoon that we got past the purely geological adventures. All before it was volcanic flame and steaming rains washing over the shifting bones of continents and into seas, and it was only at 5 o'clock that the first organic life began to appear. The fire of those volcanoes, the strength of the tectonic plates, she says, is with us still. For in our very bodies we carry the traces of Gaia's story as organic life. We were aquatic first, as we remember in our mother's wombs growing those vestigial gills and fins. The salt from those early seas flows still in our sweat and tears. The age of the dinosaurs we carry with us too in our reptilian brain right there, the bottom of your spine. And when, she asks, 24 hours, when did mammals appear? In those 24 hours, it wasn't until 11:30 at night. And when did we become human? 1 second to midnight. Now she goes on, she says, well, what would happen? What would happen if we took that 1 second, all of human history, and we made that one day, just 24 hours? Now, more than half of human history, more than half of it, we were living in small groups in Africa. All of us, all of our ancestors, yours, mine, everyone in this room. And that first half of human history was all spent right there in the cradle of humanity. But then some of our ancestors stayed and others spread out. Some of them spread out across the earth, and agriculture and domesticated animals and great cities and all of those things that we think about of what it means to be human in this day and age. All of that, the last 2 minutes of the day. Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, all of them, more or less. It's 1,000 years of time between Muhammad and Buddha, but nonetheless, all of that wisdom that we think of as so ancient. 6 seconds to midnight. Our lives as human beings are not the end of the story. They aren't the purpose or the point of the universe. We are lucky passengers on a ride that was here long before smartphones and streaming, before LASIK and laptops, and all that we are and all that we love is part of that great unfolding story. And so are the rising and the falling of the waves on the shore. Some call it evolution, and others call it God.
like tides on crescent sea beach, when moon so new and thin, into our hearts' high yearnings come welling, surging in, come from the mystic ocean whose rim no foot has trod. Some people call it longing, and others call it God.
So there are a lot of parts to spiritual growth, deepening in this life and living most fully in the days that we're given. And yet, across time and space, again and again, the wisdom traditions across the world have offered up the importance of contemplation, the contemplative path, as one well worth following. And Charles Darwin knew it too. He said at the end of that seminal work on the origin of species, it's interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, and various insects flitting about, with worms crawling through the deep earth, and to reflect on those elaborately constructed forms, so different from one another, and dependent on one another, in so complex a manner, have been all produced by laws acting around us. There is a grandeur to this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It is a call to sit with awe and wonder that comes with seeing that we know that we are all relations, that we are all interdependent, dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, he said, each and every one of us tied together, like the strands of a vast web greater than we can imagine. It's not just scientists, it's religious leaders and teachers that have been calling us to this awareness, to pay attention, not just to how different we are, important though that is, but also how the things that affect one affect us all. And the way that each of us is of value, each with gifts to give and tools to sharpen, our interdependence doesn't make us less real. It just reminds us we're not in this alone, my friends. And then we can begin to wake our sense of belonging and asking not just what does this mean for me, what does this mean for us? Not codependence, not independence, but interdependence. Individuals with skin and minds and spirits that have been connected to each other and to other human beings and to every other living thing, literally, since before you were born. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh put it this way. He held up a piece of paper, and he said, this piece of paper I'm holding right now in my hand is something that exists right now. And then he said, can we establish a time and place for the birth of this paper? His answer was that it is very difficult to establish. Impossible, actually, he says, because before it manifested as a piece of paper, it was already here in the form of a tree and the sun and of a cloud. And without the sun and without the rain, the tree would never have lived, and there never would have been this piece of paper. I touch the sun when I touch this piece of paper, and I touch the clouds, and there is a cloud floating in this piece of paper. You don't have to be a poet to see it, he said. Or if you want a slightly more secular source for your wisdom, the American author John Steinbeck went during a slow period in his career on a long journey with his dear friend Ed Ricketts to the Sea of Cortez, wrote a book about it. And in it, he said, most of the feeling we call religious, most of the mystical outcrying, which is one of the most prized and used and desired reactions of our species, is really the understanding and the attempt to say that humanity is related to the whole thing, related inextricably to all reality, known and unknowable. It is a simple thing to say and a profound feeling that made of it a Jesus, a St. Augustine, a Roger Bacon, a Charles Darwin, and Einstein. Each of them discovered in their own tempo and their own way a voice that discovered and reaffirmed with astonishment the knowledge that all things are one thing and that one thing is all things. Plankton, a shimmering phosphorescence on the sea, and spinning planets and expanding universe, all bound together by the elastic string of time. And so, he said, it is advisable to look from the tide pool to the stars, and then back to the tide pool again. May we make it so. So as you go into the week ahead, remember, you don't need to be John Steinbeck or Charles Darwin, Jane Goodall, or any of the other amazing minds of our time. You need only to take with you that spirit of awe and contemplation, and to remember we are all connected. We are all part of a universe that is still unfolding, conscious of itself as it expands beyond the farthest reaches of time. So as you go into the week, may you take with you contemplative spirit, a readiness for awe, and may you find the whale sharks, the eagles, or maybe just an anthill that calls you in. Go in peace, go in love, go and be blessed and be a blessing.
Third verse. Like tides on crescent sea beach, when moon so new and thin, into our hearts high